Section 14 of Thoughts on Art and Life. Thoughts on Science, Part 2. In Praise of the Sun. 31. If you look at the stars, warding off the rays, as may be done by looking through a small hole made by the extreme point of a fine needle placed so as almost to touch the eye, they will appear so small as to seem as though nothing could be smaller. It is owing to their great distance that they appear so small, for many of them are very many times larger than the star which is the earth with its water. Now reflect what appearance this our star must have from so great a distance, and then consider how many stars might be placed, both in longitude and latitude, between those stars which are sown in the dark space. I can never refrain from blaming many of the ancients who said that the size of the sun was no greater than it appears, among whom was Epicurus. I believe he founded his reasoning on a light placed in our atmosphere equidistant from the center of the earth, which, to any one looking at it, never appears to diminish in size from whatever distance it is seen. 32. I shall reserve the reasons of its size and power for later. But I greatly marvel that Socrates should have depreciated such a body, and that he should have said that it resembled an incandescent stone, and he who opposed him as regards this error acted rightly. But I wish I had words to blame those who seek to exalt the worship of men more than that of the sun, since in the universe there is no body of greater magnitude and power to be seen than the sun. And its light illuminates all the celestial bodies which are distributed throughout the universe, and the vital spark descends from it, because the heat which is in living beings comes from the soul, and there is no other center of heat and light in the universe, as will be shown later, and it is certain that those who have elected to worship men as gods, as Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, etc., have fallen into a profound error, since even if a man were as great as our earth, he would have the appearance of a little star, which appears like a dot in the universe, and moreover these men are mortal, and decay and corrupt in their sepulchres. 33. Epicurus perhaps saw the shadows of columns on the walls in front of them equal to the diameter of the column which cast the shadow, and since the breadth of the shadows are parallel from beginning to end, he considered that he might infer that the sun also was directly opposite to this parallel, and consequently no broader than the column, and he did not perceive that the diminution of the shadow was insensibly small owing to the great distance of the sun. If the sun were smaller than the earth, the stars in a great portion of our hemisphere would be without light, in contradiction to Epicurus, who says the sun is only as large as it appears to be. 34. Epicurus says the sun is the size it seems to be. Hence, as it seems to be a foot in breadth, we must consider that to be its size. It follows that when the moon eclipses the sun ought not to appear the larger, as it does. Hence, the moon being smaller than the sun must be less than a foot in breadth, and consequently when the earth eclipses the moon it must be less than a foot by a finger's breadth, inasmuch as if the sun is a foot in breadth, and the earth casts a conical shadow on the moon, it is inevitable that the luminous cause of the conical shadow must be greater than the opaque body which causes it. 35. Measure how many times the diameter of the sun will go into its course in 24 hours. And thus we can see whether Epicurus was correct in saying the sun was only as large as it appeared to be, for, as the apparent diameter of the sun is about a foot, and as the sun would go 1,000 times into its course in 24 hours, it would have travelled 1,000 feet, that is, 300 arms' length, which is the sixth of a mile. Thus, the course of the sun during 24 hours would have been the sixth part of a mile, and this venerable snail, the sun, would have travelled 25 arms' length in an hour. The sun's heat. 36. They say that the sun is not hot because it is not the color of fire, but whiter and clearer. And the answer to this is that when molten bronze is hottest, it resembles the color of the sun, and when it is less hot, it has the color of fire. 37. It is proved that the sun is by nature hot and not cold, as has already been stated. If rays of fire play on a concave mirror when it is cold, the rays refracted by the mirror will be hotter than the fire. The rays emitted from a sphere of glass filled with cold water, which are reflected from a fire, will be warmer than the fire. It follows from these two experiments that the heat of the rays reflected by the mirror or the sphere of cold water are hot by virtue, and not because the mirror or the sphere is hot. And in this case it occurs that the sun, passing through these bodies, heats them by its virtue. And, owing to this, they have inferred that the sun is not hot, which by the aforesaid experiments has been proved to be exceedingly hot, by the experiment of the mirror and the sphere, which are cold in themselves, and reflect the hot rays of the fire and render them hotter, because the first cause is hot. And the same thing occurs as regards the sun, which, being hot in itself, and passing through these cold mirrors, refracts great heat. It is not the light of the sun which gives warmth, but its natural heat. Rays of the sun. 38. The rays of the sun pass through the cold region of the air without any change being effected in their nature. They pass through glasses full of cold water without suffering change. Through whatever transparent spot they pass, it is as though they passed through so much air. Light of the stars. 39. Some writers allege that the stars shine of themselves, saying that if Venus and Mercury did not shine of themselves, when their light comes between them and the sun, they would darken as much of the sun as they could hide from our eye. This is false, because it is proved that a dark body placed against a luminous body is enveloped and altogether covered by the lateral rays of the remaining part of that body, and thus remains invisible, as may be proved when the sun is seen through the boughs of a leafless tree at a long distance. The boughs do not hide any portion of the sun from our eyes. The same thing occurs with the above-mentioned planets, which, though they have no light in themselves, do not, as has been said, hide any portion of the sun from our eyes. Second proof. They say that the stars shine most brightly at night in proportion as they are high, and that, if they did not shine of themselves, the shadow cast by the earth between them and the sun would darken them, since they would not see nor be seen by the sun. But these have not taken into consideration that the conical shadow of the moon does not reach many of the stars, and even for those it does reach, the shadow is diminished to such an extent that it covers very little of the star, and the remaining part is illumined by the sun. On the nature of the moon. 40. The moon having density and gravity, how does it stand? 41. 1. No very light object is opaque. 2. Nothing light can remain beneath that which is heavier. 3. Whether the moon is the center of its elements or not. And if it has no fixed position like the earth in the center of its elements, why does it not fall to the center of our elements? And if the moon is not in the center of its elements and does not fall, it must then be lighter than any other element. And if the moon is lighter than the other elements, why is it opaque and not transparent? 42. No body which has density is lighter than the air. Having proved that the part of the moon which shines consists of water which mirrors the body of the sun and reflects for us the splendor it receives from the sun, and that if there were no waves in these waters it would appear small, but almost as bright as the sun, it must now be shown whether the moon is a heavy or a light body. If it is a heavy body, admitting that from the earth upwards with every grade of distance lightness must increase, so that water is lighter than earth, air is lighter than water, and fire lighter than air, and so on in succession, it would seem that if the moon had density, as it has, it must have gravity, and if it has gravity, the space in which it lies could not contain it, and consequently it would fall towards the center of the universe and be joined to the earth. Or, if not the moon itself, its waters would fall from the moon and strip it and fall towards the center, leaving the moon bare and lusterless. Whence, as this could not happen, as reason would tell us, it is manifest that the moon is surrounded by its elements, that is to say, water, air, and fire, and thus it sustains itself by itself in that space, as our earth is suspended with its elements in this part of space. Heavy bodies act in their elements there, just as other heavy bodies act in ours. On the harmony of the spheres. 43. A sound is produced by the movement of the air in friction against a dense body, and should it be produced by two weighty bodies, it is owing to the atmosphere which surrounds them, and this friction consumes the bodies, so that it follows that the spheres in their friction, owing to there being no atmosphere between them, do not generate sound. And if this friction were a fact, during the many centuries the spheres have revolved, they would be consumed by the immense velocity expended daily. And even if they produce sound, the sound could not travel, because the sound caused by percussion under water is scarcely noticeable, and it would be less than noticeable in the case of dense bodies. The friction of polished bodies produces no sound, and similar result would be produced in the contact or friction of the spheres, and if the spheres are not polished in their contact and friction, it follows that they are rough. Again, their contact is not continuous. This being the case, a vacuum is produced, which it has been proved does not exist in nature. Therefore we conclude that friction would have consumed the ends of each sphere, and in proportion as a sphere has a greater velocity in the center than at the poles, it would be consumed to a higher degree at the center than at the poles, and then the friction would cease, and the sound would cease also, and the spheres would cease to revolve unless one sphere revolved eastward and the other northward. 44. Worlds gravitate in the midst of their own elements. The yellow or yolk of an egg remains in the middle of the albumen without moving on either side, and is lighter or heavier or equal to this albumen, and if it is lighter it ought to rise above all the albumen and stop in contact with the shell of the egg, and if it is heavier it ought to sink, and if it is equal to it, it can stand at one of the ends as well as in the center or below. The earth appears a star. 45. The object of my book is to prove that the ocean, with the other seas, by means of the sun causes our world to shine like the moon and to appear as a star to other worlds, and this I will prove. The earth a star. 46. In your discourse you must prove that the earth is a star like the moon, and thus you will bear witness to the glory of our universe. And thus you must discourse on the size of many stars. 47. How the earth is a star. The earth, in the midst of the sphere of water which clothes the greater part of it, taking its light from the sun and shining in the universe like the other stars, shows itself to be a star as well. To prove the earth a star. 48. First of all define the eye. Then show how the twinkling of a star exists really in the eye, and why one star should twinkle more than another, and how the rays of the stars are born in the eye. Say that if the twinkling of the stars were, as it appears to be, really in the stars, that this twinkling appears to extend in proportion to the body of the star. The star, therefore, being larger than the earth, this motion made in an instant of time would in its velocity double the size of the star. Then prove that the surface of the atmosphere, contiguous to fire, and the surface of fire, where it ends, is the point in which the rays of the sun penetrate and bear the image of the celestial bodies, which are large when they rise and set, and small when they are on the meridian. Earth not the center of the universe. 49. The earth is not the center of the orbit of the sun, nor the center of the universe, but in the center of its companion elements and united with them. And if anyone were to stand on the moon, when the moon and the sun are beneath us, our earth, with its element of water, would appear and shine for him just as the moon appears and shines for us. 50. The earth, shining like the moon, has lost a great part of its ancient splendor by the decrease of the waters. 51. Nothing is generated in a place where is no sentient vegetable and rational life. Feathers grow on birds and change every year. Coats grow on animals and are changed every year, with some exceptions, like the lion's beard and the cat's fur, and such. Grass grows in the fields and leaves on the trees, and every year they are renewed in great part. Thus we can say that the spirit of growth is the soul of the earth, the soil its flesh, the ordered arrangement of rocks its bones, of which mountains are formed, the tufa its tendons, its blood the veins of water which surround its heart, which is the ocean, its breathing and increase and decrease of blood in the pulses the ebb and flood of the sea, and the heat of the spirit of the world is fire which pervades the earth, and the vital soul dwells in the fires which form various apertures of the earth issue in springs and sulphur minerals and volcanoes, as in Mount Etna in Sicily and in many other places. 52. The ancients called man the world in miniature, and certainly the name is a happy one, because man being composed of earth, water, air, and fire, the body of the earth resembles the body of man. As man has in him bones for the support and framework of his flesh, likewise in the world the rocks are the supports of the earth. As man has in him a pool of blood in which the lungs rise and fall in their breathing, so the body of the earth has its ocean which rises and falls every 6 hours as if the world breathed. As from the aforesaid pool of blood veins issue which ramify throughout the human body, so does the ocean fill the body of the earth with innumerable veins of water. The body of the earth likes sinews, which do not exist because sinews are made for movement, and the world being in perpetual stability, no movement occurs, and there being no movement, sinews are not necessary, but in all other points they resemble each other greatly. 53. Water is the driver of nature. End of section 14.